This podcast is brought to you in part by Magical Mystery Camp, coming to Big Indian, New York, just 2.5 hours from New York City, the week of Paul McCartney's 84th birthday, June 16th through the 19th, featuring a number of special guests, including the Fab Four, as well as singer, songwriter, musicians Martin Sexton, Gail Ann Dorsey, Cindy Cash Dollar, and more. For more information, check out magicalmysterycamp.com/something.
Excellent, Master Robin. Your turn at the Boy Scouts vaudeville show should prove what I believe is called a doozer.
Cool it, Ringo.
Hello and welcome to episode 321 of Something About the Beatles podcast. Now, the topic here today is the overlap of the Beatles in comic world, which covers an awful lot of ground. Now, I will tell you that I wasn't particularly a comic book fan in my formative years, which is to say that I wasn't into superheroes. I wasn't into Marvel or DC. I wasn't into any of that stuff per se. What I was into was Mad Magazine and Classics Illustrated, but the other things weren't really my thing. And I will say that some people think of comics as a genre, something that my guests today push back on. It's a medium. It is a platform for telling stories. And we're familiar, especially now with the big blockbuster pictures coming out of Hollywood these days. That's a thing that has broadened the reach and the exposure of these things. But this was a topic that never would have occurred to me because of my ignorance on the subject till it was brought up by Glenn Greenberg, returning guest to the show, who has been on a number of times. We've done the John and George and Paul and George shows in the past, a few other things. He's a guy that has one foot in comics world professionally. He is a journalist. He's done a bunch of Beatle writing, which is how he came to me as a guy to have a conversation with on the show. But he also used to work for Marvel as a writer and editor. So he had this idea focusing on how the Beatles were depicted in comic world. Everything from certain issues of Batman to the 1978 Marvel Beatles story comic book to Vivek Tiwari's The Fifth Beatle graphic novel to Carol Tyler's Fab Four Mania, another favorite guest on this show. So that's an awful lot of ground. And joining me for the conversation is a actual comic book artist and writer, Stephen DeStefano. Now, I have appeared on a show that he does, and you can check the newsletter for the link to that or on my socials. It's on YouTube, where he has mostly conversations with comic books related people, which I most certainly am not. But there's enough overlap with his Beatle fandom to have made it worth his while and certainly worth my time. It was a lot of fun. But anyway, I thought it'd be great to bring Stephen into the conversation. And he's certainly given his background in history and both love of the Beatles and immersion in comics world, as well as Glenn's. It would basically be a tutorial for me as somebody completely ignorant on this stuff. You'll hear in the talk, I did not know what Silver Surfer was. I'd never heard that before. Apparently it's a thing and a big thing. So for anybody who listens to the show that is already well-versed in comics world, good for you. This will be an interesting talk with two people who are creators from that background, and as well as big Beatle people. If you are like me, somebody completely oblivious to this as an art form, well, then you're in for a treat, because it's a big exploration of not only how they've been depicted in this medium, but really what it means as a medium, as a way for storytelling, as a way of presenting history and true stories, and how it is utterly suited as another way to tell a story, to reach people and to bring an emotional and psychological truth that will resonate with the beholder. Anyway, it's a long, overly windy way of saying what the point of this show is. I do hope you check it out, listen to it all the way through. I think there's going to be some eyes opened with this. I will tell anybody who isn't already a subscriber to the SATB newsletter, satb2010@gmail.com. I will provide links to a lot of what we talk about. the 1978 Marvel Beatles story, as well as the 1970 Batman 222, depicting, well, you'll hear it as we talk about it in this show, and other stuff. So do check it out. It is worth your while, and join the other people who have subscribed to this point. And everybody who is a subscriber seems to love it, and that's why I keep doing it. Otherwise, it would not be worth my time. Now, this episode and this podcast is brought to you by DistroKid, also by Magical Mystery Camp, coming up in June this year, the week of Paul McCartney's birthday. And I will tell you that one of the guests here, Stephen DeStefano, he and I met at last year, 2025's Magical Mystery Camp. He had been a listener in the show. He had heard about the camp on the show and decided to check it out as a guy who lives in Manhattan, so it wasn't that big a stretch, 2.5 hours away. And I think it's safe to say he loved it. But the cool thing for me was he came up to me, approached me, and we ended up hanging out all weekend and had a friendship going ever since. I am very gratified to know him, but that's the kind of thing you can expect from Magical Mystery Camp. You meet good people. You're among your people if you are a Beatle person, and I can't recommend it enough for anybody who's able to take it in. And it is, as I said, 2.5 hours outside of New York. It's a 3-day plus event with tons of music brought to you by the Fab Four and lots of guests. You can check out their site, magicalmysterycamp.com, for the details. Anyway, here we go with the conversation. Beatles in Comic World, Beatles Comic-Con, as I call it, with Glenn Greenberg and Stephen DeStefano. I'm here to learn and, and react. So I will let you guys unfold the story however you want to do it, and I'll just chime in with questions as they arise, representing the audience.
Okay. I know, at least even in passing, I know every reference that Glenn's made to the Beatles in comics, but I don't have them in front of me. It's been a long time since I've had, the Marvel Beatles Super Spectacular in front of me.
I did own that. That was like 78, 79?
78.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know that
It
George
was,
Perez drew it. I don't know who
Although
wrote
you
it.
couldn't tell by looking at it.
No, because Klaus Janson inked it. Yeah.
Right, yeah.
Who wrote it?
David Anthony Kraft. He
Okay, that
packaged
makes
it.
sense.
He put the whole thing together. It was packaged the whole thing for Marvel. I don't think it was directly done for Marvel. I think it was directly done for his own little company, and he was going to do
fascinating.
more.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean Marvel was loosey-goosey back then. It wasn't Disney owned. It was a mom and pop
Right.
basically operation. So yeah, Dave Kraft can come in, and I think it was called Mad Genius Productions, I think it was called, and so they
Okay,
were
wow.
the packager of it. And so yeah, they were going to do a whole line. They were going to do different rock groups, and I think no, he didn't do the Kiss one. Kiss was an in-house. Kiss was an in-house job.
Oh, okay.
That was the
I was going to
first.
say Kiss
that
was huge.
Kiss was the first. You must have heard of this one, Robert. They put the blood in the ink. They donated their own blood to put in the ink. You know about this?
I've heard that. Is that real?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was it because it was certainly
Yeah.
publicized. I remember it from being
Yeah.
a 10-year-old that's what it was. Yeah.
That was the first rock music magazine really that Marvel did. And so yeah, they flew out to the plant and they donated their blood, and Stan Lee was there watching all this, a big publicity thing. And then about 2 issues later, they did the Beatles. It's called The Beatles Story, and that's what it is. It's basically the history of the Beatles told in comic book form. I just read it again after a long time. I was surprised at how vividly I remembered it, how accurately I remembered it.
Oh, interesting.
It's basically an illustrated timeline. It really is. And then this happened, and then this happened, and then this, they had to deal with this, and very narrative. And then occasionally they throw in like a word balloon, like, oh, blimey, now we're at Shea Stadium kind of thing,
I think I've told you guys this, full disclosure. I was not a comics person per se.
Yeah.
I had familiarity with them around the house, where whatever my brothers happened to have. The ones that I personally read, Mad Magazine, if you call that a comic book,
Yeah,
it was
sure.
drawn. And Classic Illustrated. I loved Classic Illustrated.
Okay.
But it was at that time in my fandom, the late 70s, there wasn't a whole lot of Beatle books you can go to a bookstore and buy. There was a handful.
Right.
But I was reading rock publications regularly. Rolling Stone, Circus, Cream, Crawdaddy when I could find it. There was some independent fanzines. Trouser Press eventually came along. But I believe, as I'm visualizing this, it was in the pages of either Circus or Cream that they had as a little news blurb that there was this Beatle comic magazine coming out. And that's how I knew to look for it and find it, bought it, probably read it once and put it away,
Yeah.
like I was with the other stuff I'd find on the newsstand that was Beatle relevant, like Welcome Back Beatles. There was a whole series of those junk things, and the
Yep.
National Lampoon October 77 Beatles issue.
Yep.
So it was just one more thing for the paper collection. And what I remember, like right now, I have not looked at it in years, but there was an illustration from it that I think got run in Circus or Cream, whichever I was reading about it. That was George Martin dramatically, this angle looking up at him, holding a reel of tape,
Yeah.
like circa 62. So
Yep.
that's mostly what I remember.
Yep. I just looked at it the other day.
Okay.
Your memory is perfectly accurate. The funniest thing about that magazine is it's emblazoned right on the cover, fully unauthorized, and they really made a big deal that this is like unauthorized. We don't have to answer to anybody in terms of telling this story. This is the most sanitized, innocent. There's absolutely nothing controversial about it whatsoever. They might as well have sent it to Apple or
Yeah.
to the Beatles to get it authorized because it was so clean, so innocent.
Yeah, it's not even just that, Glenn. It's also very dull. That's the thing that my takeaway from it was it was really kind of boring. The only thing I actually remember about it, there's like, they always had to do stuff like this. Paul's, for whatever reason, holding up comic books or something. And like John saying something like, I'm completely making this up probably, but John saying something like, put down those mags, man. Like, we have to make the Sergeant Pepper or something. And it's like, no human being talks like that, But that's all I remember, actually.
Yeah.
So
there is a little bit like that in there.
Yeah, I love that, like, they had to get, like, that he's holding, like, Iron Fist or whatever, whatever he was holding in the drawing, Paul. But it cracks me up. All this to say, like, I don't have a structure in my head. I'll just feel it out and go along with wherever the wind takes us. Because I can be Jimmy the Greek. I can have color, but I don't really have, like I said, even these comics that I mentioned, like, I don't have them in front of me. I couldn't even find my copy of Babies in Black, which is actually a really, really good book, I thought.
Wow. Okay, we'll have to speak to that. So that's my sole sort of acquaintance with anything in Beatles comics. I've learned of things since, but I remember Venus and Mars when that came out and Magneto and Titanium Man.
Yeah.
I didn't know what the hell that was. For all I knew, it was something he made up. But come to find out, it's a thing.
Yeah.
So for the sake of listeners, go ahead and explain it if you would.
Sure. My understanding is that Paul and Linda took their kids on vacation, I guess to Jamaica, and the kids were bored, and he found a bunch of Marvel comics on sale at, I guess at the local newsstand or wherever, and he bought the comics for the kids, and they loved them. He kept them occupied. And then Paul read them, and he was like, this is great. Got really sort of jazzed about it. He was like inspired. Now, Magneto, for those of you, at this point, I think everybody knows who Magneto is.
Probably everybody knows who Magneto is, yeah.
You're shaking? Okay. Magneto, so
Okay.
you haven't seen any of the X-Men movies, I guess?
Mm-mm.
Okay, wow. All right.
Okay.
Well, Magneto is a villain in the X-Men. He's the main villain in the X-Men, and he's got magnetic powers. He controls he has the power of magnetism and all that. And Titanium Man is an enemy. He's like the Russian version of Iron Man. And so he wears green armor the way Iron Man wears red and gold armor. And that's pretty much
they're
all
both
you
villains?
need. They're both villains, yeah.
They have nothing to do with each other, actually. It's very strange that
Yeah,
Paul
that's
actually
true.
melded them together because they probably never even met in the comics. But
Well, one has the power of
probably-
magnetism and one wears a metal suit. So I guess that's the connection that he made.
Right.
Well, then
right,
tell
right,
me
right,
this.
yeah.
The lyric says he depicts them. So we went out, Magneto and Titanium Man, and the Crimson Dynamo came along for the ride. Does any of his
Crimson
narrative make any
Dynamo is a
sense?
character.
The
No.
Crimson Dynamo is another villain. The Crimson Dynamo is another armored villain from Iron Man.
Okay.
So
So,
does it make
so is there
it
an actual
doesn't-
story being told in that song?
Not really. It's stream of consciousness, I think.
Okay. So it's just word salad.
It's
The
like
same
I-
way in Bungalow Bill, Captain Marvel zapped him right. But what does Captain Marvel have to do with Bungalow Bill?
Yeah.
It's a non
yeah,
sequitur.
it's-
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Interesting.
It's like a lot of Paul songs. It just kind of like happens. It doesn't really seem to have any sense to it. It just sounded good at the time, I suppose, to him, and it just made its way in. But as a kid listening to it, I'm thinking like, well, Crimson Dynamo has nothing to do with Magneto. That's ridiculous because I knew the continuities back then, and I'm thinking like, well, that's not a thing. They didn't meet. They have nothing to do with each other, and their bad guys. Was
Wow.
Paul hanging out with them for? That kind of
Yeah.
thing.
Did
It
you
was
guys
just
like the song?
when I finally got to, I mean, I'd heard about it for years and years, and then when I finally started having like disposable income and started buying Wings albums, and I finally got to hear it, I was like, hey, it's cool. It's got a nice groove to it, but it's not a great song. It's not one of his best, but it's cute. But I remember reading in the Marvel comics at the time about the song, and Stan Lee was like over the moon that Marvel was getting this kind of publicity. The characters that he had worked on was getting this kind of publicity with a Paul McCartney song. And Jack Kirby, who co-created at least a few of the characters, I know that he was excited about it. He was actually at one of the Wings shows during the Wings of Over America when they were beaming the images of Magneto and Titanium Man over on the stage. Paul actually supposedly acknowledged that Kirby was there in the audience, and they met backstage, and Kirby had drawn a caricature, a picture of Paul and Linda basically confronting Magneto. Either Jack had done his homework or somebody gave him reference, but Paul and Linda are dressed in the outfits that they are wearing. You could see them wearing in the Wings Over America album. They're wearing like top hats, black top hats.
Like Venus and Mars, like the Mardi Gras parade, right?
Oh, that's it. Venus and Mars.
Probably, yeah.
So somebody, I guess, gave Kirby a picture from that, and he drew them based on that. Paul and Linda confronting Magneto wearing those black top hats.
Did Magneto look like Alan Klein?
Yeah, it just so happens Alan Klein looks like every villain in comic books, so that's not really that big a deal. But just for some context, I think Jack Kirby probably was in his at least 40s at that time in the 70s.
Yeah,
maybe in his 50s, possibly.
Oh, 50s.
And Jack Kirby
because
you think? Yeah.
Stan was in his 40s in the 60s, and Jack was a few years older. So Stan would have been, if I do the math, Stan was about, in 1975, Stan was probably about 43, 44. Jack would have been in his early to mid 50s at that point.
Just for the sake of clarity, I know the name Stan Lee, and I'm probably going to sound like an idiot by asking, who did he create? What's his famous characters?
Stan co-created the Hulk, the Fantastic Four, Thor, Spider-Man, the X-Men,
Silver Surfer,
Daredevil,
Black Panther.
Yes, those characters.
Yeah, so he's like the Beatles of comic world.
Yeah, to a certain him and Jack were like kind of like the Lennon and McCartney.
That's a good way to put it, Glenn. Yeah. Jack Kirby is kind of like, to comic book artists at least like myself, Jack Kirby is like the Babe Ruth of comic books. He actually started his career in the 40s. But like, a lot of us people of a certain age envision like for themselves, but he really, exploded. I mean, he was really well known in the 1940s, but in the 1960s with the Marvel Comics, like, his career went insane. He just exploded. And that's a lot of it thanks to Stan Lee. And Stan Lee to this day gets his name on most everything, and rightfully so. But Stan was a fantastic editor. Stan recognized fantastic talent. And he knew that with Jack, you basically leave him alone and you sort of rein it in a little bit. So not to get too arcane, Glenn, you can back me up or not. But like essentially what would happen is back in the Fantastic Four Thor years of the 1960s, Stan and Jack would meet. They would sort of like come up with story ideas. And then Jack would go home and he would like come up with essentially the story by himself and draw it all out. And he was a very prolific artist. Then, he would bring it back into Stan.
Stan would come in and write the dialogue and the captions based on the artwork.
Yeah.
And Stan was the editor also, so he had final say over the complete work. So he was the writer and the editor.
Right. And as a kid, there was this idea that Stan Lee was the greatest writer in comics of all time. I'm looking back at it, and I think that his reputation has changed, although it's still great. My feeling is that Stan was one of the best editors of all time. He knew what talent was, and he knew how to handle it. And he certainly co-created. He's very, very responsible for Spider-Man in a large way. But Stan was a fantastic editor. He knew talent, and he knew how to organize it. And he also knew how to promote it himself and his company. There's a reason why anybody who knows the Marvel movies of the last 15, 20 years or whatever, there's a reason why, you might recognize Stan from those movies because Stan actually appears as an actor in those movies. And Stan certainly deserves his recognition. But at the same time, there are so many artists who really, in some ways, created the Marvel universe around Stan. But Stan knew how to marshal it. Stan knew how to promote it, and he certainly knew how to put his name everywhere on it. He was a fantastic showman, and I have no idea what he thought of the Beatles at all.
He definitely saw the Beatles as a way to promote his stuff, the books that he was working on. He recognized them as a major force. I think I was doing the research, and he did a story. He wrote a story in Strange Tales 130. So it featured, if you know the Fantastic Four, it featured the Thing and the Human Torch together, a team up. They're from the Fantastic Four, and the story is called Meet the Beatles. And it's a story that it's a silly little, it's a trifle. It's like a 10 or 12 page story. The Thing and the Human Torch have like this silly little adventure, and throughout it sprinkled these references to the Beatles, that the Beatles are in town. They're going to be taking their girlfriends to see the Beatles in concert. The Beatles actually pop up in a couple of panels here and there throughout the story. And then the Thing and the Human Torch end up not being able to get to see them. The concert is over by the time they get there. Okay. Anyway, number one, the fact that the Beatles are in the story is beside the point. It could have been anybody. It could have been Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons, and the story wouldn't have been any different. It could have been the Beach Boys, and the story wouldn't have been any different. The only thing that makes it Beatles is there's references to Beatles wigs in the story, and at one point the Beatles show up, and the artist, I guess, didn't have any reference for them or decided it wasn't important to make them look like the Beatles. If you squint really, really hard, one of them kind of looks like Ringo because of the nose. But otherwise, they don't look anything like the Beatles. There's nothing.
What year was this?
This was, okay, I'm glad you asked.
Probably 64.
It came out, it hit the stands circa December of 64, which means it was being worked on in the summer of 64. So they were probably wrapping up the tour when this story was being worked on, which would make sense. That's why Stan probably had it in his mind, is the Beatles are in America getting all this attention. Sure, let's let them in a story.
Well, it's interesting that, because God knows they couldn't get their hands on an image of the Beatles to work off of at this time, 1964. It makes me wonder who they were pitching this to. Was it to existing comic readers and give them something topical? Or were they trying to bring in Beatle fans to start picking up comics? All of the above?
Both. This is why Stan was such a great editor. He was always looking to expand the readership. So, it was of the moment. The kids loved it. And so, it says right on the cover, there's a shot on the cover of the Thing, who, if you know the Fantastic Four, the Thing is a big, rocky, jagged-skinned orange monster. It's the Thing wearing a Beatles wig. Okay. And it says Meet the Beatles emblazoned right on the cover. So they were trying to pull in Beatles fans and the audience that they already had.
Wow. So is this like the first crossing paths of those two worlds?
I believe so. I couldn't find anything earlier. I think this was definitely the first time I think that Marvel was making reference to the Beatles.
Yeah. And as far as DC Comics goes, I have no idea. I don't know the history, but I do have recollections of seeing like Jimmy Olsen and also in a Superman's pal.
Well,
Jimmy Olsen,
in Help.
In a Beatle wig. Oh, yeah.
There's a shot in Help when Paul's at the piano, and there's a whole bunch of DC Comics like strewn across the piano where, the sheet music would normally be. So it's issues of like Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen and Action Comics starring Superman and all that. So a very, very heavy DC Comics presence in Help.
Wow.
I noticed that, yes, as Robert pointed out earlier, like there's a schism between DC Comics and Marvel Comics. Anybody who grew up in the last 50 years like I did. And I always noticed it was very strange that Paul had all these DC comics strewn across his keyboard and not a Marvel comic in sight. Very, very strange.
Well, Marvel was still kind of a smaller company at that time. It was on the rise. I don't know how well the Marvel distribution was in England at that point, but DC, at that point, Superman had been around for 25 years or more. I just think that Superman was just a bigger presence and had greater name and visual recognition. So it makes sense
Established.
that a movie filmed in England, it would be a bunch of DC comics, specifically Superman. I don't know if Marvel had really sort of like made an inroad in England at that point. I could be wrong, but I don't think so.
Mm-hmm. To ask another stupid question, Captain Marvel, is that a Marvel product?
Captain Marvel, boy, that's a long, convoluted story, but Captain Marvel was a character that was published in the 1940s. And what happened was DC felt that Captain Marvel was too similar to Superman, so they basically sued it out of existence. And then in the early 1970s, DC actually bought the character or licensed the character and brought it back. But when John sings, so Captain Marvel zapped him right between the eyes. Well, Captain Marvel, he had to have been referring to the 1940s version that said Shazam, and he gets hit by a lightning bolt and turns into Captain Marvel. When he says it again, he turns into a little boy named Billy Batson. So he literally gets hit by a bolt of magic lightning. So that had to have been what John was referring to.
That's got to be what John, because John would have grown up reading that stuff. Yeah.
There have been other versions of Captain Marvel published by other companies, because when Captain Marvel got sued out of existence, other companies snatched up the title, including Marvel. So they were able to make a movie a few years ago called Captain Marvel that has nothing to do with Shazam.
But Shazam is the original Captain Marvel. And that's what John would have known.
Wasn't there a 70s thing?
The
there was a TV show in the 70s called Shazam.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. Any connection?
Yeah, that's the 1940s Captain Marvel.
Okay.
If it's a kid who says Shazam, that's Captain Marvel. Yeah, sorry.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I was just going to ask, when you were talking about December 64 and the Beatles just finished a tour, they're back in England, and the comics world takes notice and decides to exploit that fad of the day. Something that's popping in my head that hasn't anything to do with comic books per se, but it does with cartoons, is, as we know, the Flintstones sort of sprung up as a version of the Honeymooners.
The Honeymooners, yeah.
Yeah, that template. And they were always utilizing pop culture, from Anne Margrock to Stoney Curtis to the Beau Brummel-Stones.
The Beau Brummel-Stones,
Is there any sort of any convergence you're seeing with Beatles in the cartoon world at that time, before the Beatles got their own Al Brodak thing? Or was that strictly separate worlds as far as you know?
Well, I haven't watched the Flintstones, and oh my God, I couldn't tell you how long. But I seem to remember like a band with Beatles wigs in the Flintstones.
Right. I could see that visual.
Yeah. And
Rolling Stones would make an obvious sort of cross current there. But
yeah, the Flintstones were making like perpetual references to the Beatles. I mean, the Beatles in quasi form made a lot of appearances, but it was never like as close as Anne Margrock or Stoney Curtis or something, or the Beau Brummel.
Right. It was never so on the nose.
Yeah.
It was never so on the nose. But there is a whole episode, and I don't know if it's pre-Al Brodax or post-Al Brodax, where there's a whole thing about bug music, and it drives the town of Bedrock insane, because obviously this music is
you say
horrible.
Oh my God, you just triggered a memory. Yes. Like you said, it's not so on the nose like Stoney Curtis and Ed Margaret, but yes, bug
it's
music.
Never on the nose.
Yes. And this was
Or
later
even
on.
to the point where their manager might have a British accent because of the recognition of the Beatles.
But at this point, I think Pebbles was in the series at this point. So this was like a few years down the road.
Okay.
Right, exactly.
So
this would have been
that started in September of 65.
Okay.
Yeah.
That makes
interesting.
sense.
Because the reason I bring this up at all is because I remember, I think they were Gold Key was the publishing, but it seemed like Hanna-Barbera had a newsstand presence in the form of comic book versions of the TV shows.
Absolutely.
Oh, sure.
Absolutely.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to mention Gold Key. And if Gold Key in comic book terms, that's a very complex history. And you could say Dell Comics, and you're talking about Gold Key, and you could say Whitman Comics, and you're talking about Gold Key. It's very strange. They did since the 40s, maybe earlier into the late 1930s, starting with Disney publishing. They did all the licensing comics, which means like they did all the characters that were not owned by Marvel or DC or the Captain Marvel line. I mean, they did Disney, they did Walter Lantz, which means Woody Woodpecker, they did the Looney Tunes. So they were all over the place. And,
shows, comics based on TV shows and movies.
Right. Yeah. All the like outer characters. In '64 they did the Beatles story, or I'm trying to think of what it's called. Um, it's called the Beatles Complete Life Stories, and that was
Mhm.
1964. And interestingly, I don't know. I have no idea who
Very
wrote
complete.
that. And But interestingly, who drew it was a guy named Joe Sinnott, who worked with Jack Kirby on the Fantastic Four for pretty much the entirety of the 1960s. He was what they
And
call an
yeah,
inker, which means he would go over Jack's quote unquote pencil roughs, because those don't print well. So you need an inker, somebody who will draw in black ink over those pencils. And Joe Sinnott was recognized as one of the very best inkers in the business, but he was also just an all-round artist. So he actually
yeah,
drew that complete life of the Beatles. He was the
yeah.
artist on that.
Were these renderings accurate? Did
Yeah,
they look like
actually
the
they
Beatles?
were. No, they actually did look like the Beatles, because that would have been a big job. And so Joe Sinnott was a very, very capable draftsman, extremely good. And he would have had all kinds of reference in front of them. Interestingly, like also going back to Dell and Gold Key, and I don't have this. I think I have read it somewhere. But Gold Key in 67, 68 published the first adaptation of the Yellow Submarine movie.
That's right.
I don't no idea who wrote that, but I have a theory. But I know it was drawn by a guy named Jose Delbo, who went on, his claim to fame
Yeah.
mostly was drawing Wonder Woman in the 1970s. It's a
Yep.
workmanlike kind of job, and it's really off kilter. It doesn't really follow the movie. The story is like, I mean, there's like all kinds of crazy lands they visit that are not like the Sea of Holes, you know?
They might have been working from an outdated script, for one thing, because I'll tell you something. I looked at that the other day, and they managed to work in not they managed to work in references to that last bit at the very end, the live action moment where the actual Beatles show up at the very end. And they have the cartoon version of this is in the comic book. The cartoon version of John does a comic book version of basically of John saying,
Newer and bluer meanies have been sighted within the vicinity of this theatre.
in the comic book context. So the weird thing is they had to have done it fairly close to when the movie was finished, because that bit was filmed pretty late in the game, wasn't it, Robert?
January 68, right before they went to India.
Okay.
But they'd
The-
seen the
the-
rough cut in
yeah.
December 67, and that's when
Okay.
they agreed, wow, this is way better than we thought it would be.
So he'll
So,
be in
yes,
it.
we will appear in your film.
Well, whenever the comic book came out, they were able to make reference to the live action bit that the Beatles filmed at the very end.
Wow.
That would
Because
make
that's on the
sense
last
because
page.
yeah, the comic art looks rushed to me. And the only thing I realized earlier as I was looking at it myself is that I was trying to think, because somehow I know that it's Jose Delbo who drew it, but I was trying to think of who wrote it. And I realized like there's a guy named Jack Mendelson who was a cartoonist who was a writer on the Yellow Submarine film. But he was actually a cartoonist. He had his own Sunday strip. For anybody that remembers newspapers with Sunday strips or comic strips, he was an exceptional cartoonist, but he wrote for Al Brodak. He wrote on the Beatles cartoon. Now, who knows how much of that Jack Mendelssohn's work actually made it to the film? Because I understand that it was somewhat rewritten as it got to Britain, and I don't know enough about that. But yeah, I mean,
Roger
I marvel
McGuff,
at like
who is a member of Scaffold, and he's also from
right, yeah,
Liverpool, was one of the guys that contributed a lot to the rewrites and whatever script doctoring went on in that film, which was a lot. Eric Siegel, of course, is the guy that had the biggest name attached to it,
Right.
and that people have said took a larger share of credit than should have been accorded him.
No surprise.
But I think McGuff to this day says that a lot of the explicitly Liverpudlian flavored wordplay came from him.
yeah. I can see Jack Mendelsohn writing the Al Brodak's early '60s TV cartoons, but I marvel because Yellow Submarine really does sound like the Lads. I mean, I know it's not the Lads, and I know it doesn't sound vocally like them, but in terms of inflections, it's not a bad writing imitation of their speech patterns. And I'm like, I don't know, a dude from the States probably can't write like that, as good a writer as he might be. It would have to be translated into Scouse in some way. So I doubt
Right.
Jack Middleton, but he was a prominent cartoonist himself, actually, which is interesting. So he
Well,
may well have
in
written that
terms
comic book. I have no idea.
I tend to think who put it out? Was it Dell or Gold Key? Do you know offhand which that they
Yeah,
were?
that was Gold Key, Glenn. Yeah, that was Gold Key. I mean,
Okay.
it's a
I tend
strange
to think
umbrella, but
I tend to think they probably gave it to one of their in-house writers because that's what they tended to do. Like whoever was, they gave it to one of their reliable freelancers. We'll probably never know because at that point, only Marvel was putting credits in the comics in the 60s. So it's tough at this point. If we don't know by now, it would be very tough to find out who actually. I'm impressed that you knew it was Jose Delbo who drew it. That's impressive.
yeah, I have no idea why I know that, but I've heard that somewhere. There must be lore. I mean, there's paperwork, probably. There's like financial paperwork that probably says this
Mhm.
stuff. There was a guy named Paul S. Newman who wrote pretty much
Yeah,
everything for Dell
yeah,
or Gold Key. But
yeah.
and he might have written it. The only reason I think maybe it was Jack Mendelson is, having looked at it, it was somewhat clever. And I know Mendelson he had his own strips it was called Jackie's Diary, which was really wonderful. And I know he wrote some stuff for Gold Key, but otherwise, yeah. And it hardly matters really because it's so anonymous anyway.
Yeah.
Really,
Yeah.
who wrote it? It feels like, well, so you're not buying it for who wrote it. You're buying it for the Beatles. So yeah, I have no idea.
Well, the other one from the time when technically the Beatles were still together, technically or around the time that was like a major story is I was telling you about this, Robert, is this issue of Batman. Batman number 222. Now, this would have come out around March 1970, okay?
Mm.
Which means it was probably worked on, I'd say November, December 69. That's how the comics work. Like you're working on the issue and then it comes out about 3 months later if you're on schedule. That's how it usually works. And then for some reason on the covers, the cover is like 3 months after the book comes out. So if it came out in March, it'll probably say June on the cover.
Probably to keep it on the newsstand longer, right?
Presumably.
Yeah.
Presumably. But
Yeah.
anyway, it's a story called Dead Till Proven Alive. And it's got this beautiful cover drawn by one of the all-time greatest artists who ever graced the comic book business, a guy named Neil Adams, okay? And it's 4 guys who look suspiciously like the Beatles coming out of the mist. And it's actually a very moody, spooky cover, okay? And they're walking towards the reader coming out through the mist. And Batman and Robin are in the foreground holding a cover that looks very much like the back cover for Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. And they're saying one of these people is dead, but which one? Okay.
Oh, wow.
And it's this mystery story that's completely centered around the Paul is dead mystery. Okay. Now, this to me works in a way that the Thing Human Torch story didn't work because number one, it is about the Beatles, although they're not called the Beatles in the story. They're called the Oliver Twists. Okay.
Are you kidding?
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. But you look at the cover, there's no mistaking who they are. And even inside, you look at the artwork and you could tell which one is supposed to be who. Okay. Even though they're not exact likenesses, you could tell who's supposed to be who. Anyway.
Are they roughly modeled on the 1969 Beatles?
I would say more like the
No.
1967, 68.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah,
again,
it's very
these
much
are
the
40s.
Pepper.
These are guys in their 40s doing these stories. They don't have their finger on the pulse of, what's going on. The writer was like in his late 50s at this point, I think, or late 40s or 50s. The artist was even, I think, older. That's what you're dealing with.
But they're hip to the Paul is dead thing.
They're hip to the Paul is dead thing, and they're able to take it and apply it to, well, if we're going to do this story, number one, it's about youth culture. Batman's got a kid partner named Robin, okay? So that works. You make that connection. Like Robin would be the one who would want to sort of solve this, and he pulls back. I'll tell you how the way Batman comes into this. This is hilarious. Bruce Wayne is a major stockholder in the record company that the Oliver Twists record for. So if this whole death thing is a hoax, Bruce Wayne doesn't want to be associated with a hoax. So Batman better step in and figure out what's going on here. So he and Robin
Is the label named after a fruit?
No, it's Eden Records.
Oh,
I don't know
okay.
what the reference is.
Apple, Eden.
Oh,
There you go. That makes sense.
Wow.
Okay.
I didn't
Wow,
make that connection.
now it's doubly more clever. That's
Now it really
now I
works.
really
Yeah.
yeah, now I really have a lot of respect for this story.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the band comes to Gotham City after a year or two where they haven't been touring, mysteriously not touring, because in that time, the rumors have been starting that Saul is dead, Saul Cartwright. Okay. And so now they're touring again. They come to Gotham. It's all four of them. And they're dismissing all the rumors that Saul is dead. And Bruce Wayne, as a stockholder in Eden Records, invites them to stay at Wayne Manor so he can keep an eye on them and gather all this data and do like voice print analysis to see if Saul's voice has changed since his early days. It's really kind of clever. And it makes the case that, yes, this story deserves to exist, whereas the other one, the Stan Lee Fantastic Four story, that was a trifle. But it's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
I could tell you, should I reveal the outcome or should we not spoil it for
No,
people?
save it.
Okay.
Tell me this. Stephen, you'd sent me that wonderful link to My Little Margie Beatles. Does this particular issue exist online where the readers can see it?
Yes.
Okay, great. We'll
My
share
Little
that
Margie,
then with the
yes.
readers.
Yes, yeah, there's a certain amount of stuff that's public domain or going under the radar that can be found. For the Batman issue that Glenn's talking about, you'd have to buy it. Or there are other ways. Glenn
There
may
are
know.
ways to
There are ways to see this stuff.
Okay, newsletter subscribers will get it to you.
Yes. Yeah, take to the high seas,
Okay.
if you know what I mean.
It's worth looking at. It's certainly worth looking at. And the interesting thing is, as Glenn pointed out, like, well, we're talking about 1970 versus 1964 in terms of the thing and the Human
Right.
Torch meeting the Beatles. And we're talking about, in both cases, these are guys in their 40s and 50s, and they are guys. There were very few women back working in comics back then, but they were there. But there were always these guys, balding with like ties and stuff who were writing and drawing this and editing them. And so,
Right.
we talk about, 1964 idea of the Beatles, which is like they're a flash in the pan. They won't be here tomorrow, but they're really huge. Let's make fun of them. Let's talk about them to get to sell a couple of extra issues. But by 1970, even, and DC Comics arguably is a much more conservative place in some ways than Marvel Comics. But they
Oh, for
would have
sure.
had to recognize, like, oh no, this is a cultural force by this point. By 1970s, the Beatles are not a flash in the pan. The Beatles are like, they're part of the zeitgeist. They're part of the culture. It's enough of a mystery to say, like, everybody knows, the story about Paul being dead, and let's write a story about that. I mean, that's how much
And-
things had changed.
And we have this character here at our company who is literally the world's greatest detective.
The world's
Who
greatest
better to
detective.
solve the Paul is dead rumor than Batman, It worked. It's very clever. It's very cute. I read it again like within the last couple of days and it's a hoot. It's silly in ways, the way comic books were not taken as seriously back then as they are now. It's a little cheesy, but there is a charm to it that is undeniable. And the big resolution is pretty damn clever, actually. So I highly recommend people seeking it out and getting their hands on it. And I think they'll enjoy it.
That's cool.
Yeah, it's a
Wow.
worthwhile. I mean, back then, for sure, the comics were just mostly considered by the people who were working in them. They were a craft, and you did your craft
Yeah.
well. So the writer of that story was a guy named Frank Robbins, who actually is one of the all-time great cartoonists, just in comics terms. In the 40s, he started drawing a strip called Johnny Hazard, which was absolutely beautiful, just stunningly beautiful. But he was well known as a writer, and he started writing for DC, and later on he ended up as an artist at Marvel. But brilliant craftsman. I mean, he knew how to craft the story, and mostly it was about the plot. Everything was about the plot, and you have to come up with a good plot. And okay, this is a mystery, so how are we going to figure out this mystery? It's well crafted piece of work for young teens. It works really well.
Yeah,
And
I
that
liked
would have
his
been the
writing
audience.
better than his art. But again,
And acquired
for a
taste.
guy,
I'm a huge fan.
yeah. But for a guy in his, again, I think he was in his late 40s at this point. For him to
Sure,
sort of
yeah.
tap into that and be aware of the Beatles hoax. And that's the other thing. The cool thing is he did his homework in the sense that the story begins. Dick Grayson Robin is in college at this point. That's where the story begins. And Dick Grayson is in his college dorm with his buddies, and they're sitting there spinning the records backwards to listen to the backwards messaging. So
Wow.
this guy did his homework, you know?
Well,
And
when
he
you
was
said that the back cover of Pepper on the front cover of this issue, I'm thinking,
Yeah.
geez, that's some really good information there.
Yeah.
As far as the clues go,
Yeah.
it's like, wow, they clearly knew what they were doing.
Yeah.
Right.
So it's impressive. It is
Yeah.
very impressive. Getting back to that Marvel super special about the Beatles, the Beatles story, the ultimate unauthorized magazine, the 78 one is just some of the real stuff that they just got wrong. They said that Stu Sutcliffe had died of a brain tumor, which is, as far as I know, not true.
No.
They never mention Brian Epstein's private life. They don't even approach that. So
Did they have him die?
he does die.
Okay.
But it's not overt that it was a drug overdose.
Oh, okay.
So again, why even brag about the fact that this thing is unauthorized? I just
Because it sells.
I guess
I want
so.
the real dirt.
I remember getting it as a kid and just being like, why is this unauthorized? There's nothing, absolutely nothing salacious in this thing.
It's interesting because around this time, 78, you had a real resurgence, this real spiking in Beatle interest. You had the Pepper film, of course. You had the Ruddles. You had the TV special with Ringo. You had in
The
79, right after, you had the Dick Clark Beatles story TV film after the Elvis
Yes,
one.
Birth of the
So
Beatles. Holy
the-
shit. Yeah.
And then
Yeah,
the
yeah.
Nicholas Schaffner book came out around that
Yes.
time.
As well as Paperback Writer, the Mark Schipper satire.
Right.
Have you guys read that?
No.
Many years ago. So to the point where I
don't know
don't
about it.
remember it, but I remember, yes.
That was that book. I was enough of a fan when that book came out, and it's all fantasy, but it was about them getting back together in the age of the Sex Pistols and disco.
Yep.
And it made me fall down on the floor laughing at so many turns in it because it was so knowing and so witty and so unbelievably good. And Mark Schipper, he's got to be one of these guys that in the 70s, you read Illustrated Record, you read Beatles Forever, of course, and maybe you read Growing Up with the Beatles by Ron Schomburg. But these were like the first, if you were a 70s kid getting into the Beatles, these were like the first books available. That one came out, I think it came out in 76, but I didn't read it probably till 77, 78. But I would have loved to have gotten him to sit down for an interview because that book is so brilliant. But he's one of these guys that has disappeared off the planet, does not want to talk about it, wants nothing to do with it. But it's too bad. And unfortunately, the way I look at it now, the way I sort of perceive it, it was very much of its time. It was brilliantly knowing and funny, but the death of John just a few years later sort of negated it all. It was like, okay, we can't laugh about certain things that are in this anymore. And it's very much of that last window between the breakup and before John reemerged that the possibility of a story like this happening, however unlikely, could happen. But now the air has gone out of the tires, I think, which is too
So I
bad.
actually don't know anything about this book, Robert. It's a book and it's fiction.
It's a book,
comedy
yeah.
fiction?
It's called Paperback Writer. There
Paperback
was
Writer.
numerous editions of it that had different covers. The one that
Okay.
I bought initially had them all in the white suits like the finale of Magical Mystery Tour.
Okay.
And there's a picture of, because the guy was some kind of journalist who wrote it, Mark Schipper. So in like the preface of the book, he's got a photograph of himself with Ringo circa 76. And the premise is Ringo divulged the Beatles' true life story to me, and this is my writing it down and retelling it. I may have forgotten a few things. And so it goes off on this whole wild thing going back to Liverpool, the rise of the Beatles, and then into the contemporary era where they reunite. And George is a religious zealot, but not the Krishna kind. He's a hardcore Christian, like obnoxiously so. And there's a whole subplot involving Sonny Bono, and the Beatles end up on this tour bill opening for Peter Frampton and the Sex Pistols.
Okay.
I remember
I need
it.
to read this. I didn't even know about it. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I recommend reading it at least once. And it's like the more you know about the Beatles, the more you will appreciate this book because the guy clearly knew his stuff.
It had a blue cover.
Yes, that's one. I've seen another one, the red cover, that I didn't see till years later.
Well, getting back, continuing with Marvel, and this is one that I think a lot of people will be interested in. I don't even know if you would know about this, Stephen, but a couple
No,
of
it's completely lost on me.
Okay. All right. So a few issues because the Beatles story was part of this series. It was a series of magazines called Marvel Super Special. Okay, that was the name of that was the title of the magazine. About 3 issues later, they did an adaptation of the movie Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. So you might be asking, they did a comic book adaptation of a musical. Yes, they did.
Which
And
itself had been based on a play, a musical stage production.
Right. But it's you kind of like you can't really hear the songs when you're reading a comic book. But and to tell you that the comic book suffered about as good a fate as the movie did.
Clearly, it was before they knew how the movie was going to turn out.
They had no idea. And what happened was they could not get cooperation from the movie. The movie kept on changing the script as they were going along. And they sent Marvel like a really outdated version of the script. So
it was produced concurrently with the movie being in production?
Pretty much.
Wow. Huh.
They couldn't get images of the movie itself, from the movie. So they had to make the set, any of it. So they had to make a lot of that stuff up. I think they couldn't get likeness rights, so the characters couldn't look like the actors playing them. It was a complete disaster, and Marvel could not get any cooperation. Oh, and then I believe that the release date for the movie got moved up so that the comic book had to get produced very, very quickly. The artist who had done the previous magazine, the Beatles story, George Perez went on to become one of the greatest comic book artists of all time. This was him in the early days of his career. He described working on this project as the nadir of his career. Anyway, Marvel got so fed up and so frustrated that in the end, they never released it in America. Ooh. They released it in France, French-speaking areas of Canada, and the Netherlands.
So, Glenn, have you read it? Have you seen it? Do you have a copy?
I can't really read it because it's not in English.
Okay, but you have a copy.
No, I don't have a copy. I've seen pages. And
okay.
Yeah, and again, George Perez went on to become one of the greatest artists in comics, and this is another case where you would not even be able to tell that he drew it because they hired an inker whose style was so overpowering. Jim Mooney inked it. So it doesn't even look like George Perez. So it was just a disaster. And for Marvel, of all companies, to say, we're not even going to release this in America, gives you an idea of just how bad they felt it turned out.
Wow.
Right.
Jeez.
Yeah. But George Perez, for your listeners, Rob, it might be aware that, as Glenn said, he went on to be considered really one of the best comic book artists in the business. And he's famous. His biggest claim to fame is as the co-creator of the new Teen Titans, which some of your readers might recognize. And he was the designated Marvel, and he started his career at Marvel Comics, drawing the Avengers early on. And he was the go-to guy for the Beatles, apparently, for Marvel Comics. But it's fascinating because that's not cheap to do an entire book and then to just kind of put it out in certain areas of the globe. Yeah. That's very strange. Yeah.
I just have to say on a personal level, it's just weird for me to be talking about all these semi-legendary comic book stories, and we're talking about the people who drew them, some of which was produced before I was even born, or I was a year old. And I got to work with a lot of these people, and I got to know them. George Perez and I would hug each other when we'd see each other. It got to that kind of level. And it's just very strange for me to be talking about this comic book that came out when I was 9 years old. And I grew up to work with some of these guys.
Did you ever have conversations about this stuff with them?
It's funny. I worked pretty closely with George for a short period of time, and I just don't think it was in my mind at the time to talk about the Beatles book because we were so focused on what we were doing at that moment, the stuff that we were working on at that time. I think it just probably wasn't even in my head, even in the back of my head. Oh yeah, he did that Beatles book. I should ask him about that,
Yeah. George was incredibly prolific too. I mean, he turned out a lot of pages. I mean, he worked for he had a long career. He's passed since, but and he put out a lot of work. And I met George a couple times up at DC Comics, and I would have been more interested in talking to him about the Teen Titans, frankly. And I was a huge Beatle fan back then, but I never would have thought he's the guy that drew Beatle comic. It's very strange. Wow. Yeah, but it is cool to meet your heroes, though. I mean, that is pretty amazing.
And to work with them is even a headier experience.
Sure.
But so that was Marvel's last real sort of flirtation in any big way, I think, with the Beatles was that Sgt. Pepper disaster. they shied away. I don't remember when they did 2 comic books based on Kiss. And
Did they?
after that, yeah, they did it.
Wow.
They did the first one with the blood, and they did the second one, which was written by a good friend of mine, actually, Ralph Macchio. He did the second one. And I think after that, they kind of moved away from rock comics altogether
Although,
for a
Glenn,
long
you
time.
said that they did an adaptation of Xanadu, the Olivia
They did do
Newton-John. Did you
they
tell us
did.
that? How did
They
that
did do
work?
it.
Again, it's like comics and music don't really mix. I mean, a
Right.
silent visual media just doesn't work with music. So I
Ma- ma-
remember that on the stands, but I didn't buy it.
yeah. I think to some extent, Marvel would seek out movies that they thought were going to be hits and do a comic
Right.
book adaptation to glom onto what they think is going to be a hit movie. In other cases, the producers or the studio came to us. I can think of one movie off the top of my head where my boss gave me a script to read for a movie adaptation that was it was a movie that was like a comic book style movie, not based on any pre-existing property, but it was inspired by comics. And my boss gave me a script to read. Give this a read and let me know what you think. The company's thinking of doing a comic book adaptation. I was like, okay. I went home, I read the script overnight, came back the next day. I said, I think this sucks. I said, we shouldn't do it. He goes, well, we are. They'd already made the deal. The studio wanted us to do it. I think they might have even been paying us to do it. Who knows? So a lot of times that's the case too. So it really is it's a matter of Marvel thought Xanadu was going to be a hit, or the producers of Xanadu came to Marvel and asked us to do a comic book adaptation as a way of helping to promote the film.
Right.
The funny thing about Xanadu is it started out, they were going to be doing a movie based on the Silver Surfer. I'm assuming, Robert, you're familiar with the Silver Surfer at least? No. Okay. Silver Surfer is a very popular comic book character. He got started in the Fantastic Four comic book and very, very popular. And at one point, a producer made a deal with Marvel to do a Silver Surfer movie, which was going to star Olivia Newton-John, not as the Silver Surfer, but as the lead female role. They approached Paul McCartney to do the music, and he was interested.
So you're talking like post-Grease, pre-Xanadu?
Post-Grease, pre-Xanadu. This would have been in 1980. And there's paperwork that exists. Paul McCartney's representative is trading letters with the producer of the film.
He's just back from Japan. He's got time on his hands.
You know what? I might actually have, hold on one second. I might actually have access to the letter.
Paul's fascination with being in a science fiction movie just astounds me. I mean, it just really blows my mind.
Okay. The letter was dated March 3rd, 1980.
There you go. Wow. He's
says-
literally just back from Japan.
He's literally, okay, is that when he's back? Okay.
Yeah.
All
he was
his
back by the
interest-
end of January. So he'd been back in England to tours in disarray. Yeah.
Right. So Paul is interested, but only insofar as the idea appeals to him and he finds the concept interesting. Before we could take it any further, we would need to know precisely what you would like Paul to do. For example, if it's the music, is it one song or several, or is it the whole score? We would also like to see some of the film when it is shot, and perhaps you could let me know when this is likely to be. And this was from his manager, Steve Shrimpton.
Wow.
Yeah.
You could tell he hadn't been living at the Asher home for a long time.
Why is that?
The difference from the high culture to the comic book culture.
You know,
Let's
it's
talk
funny
about
because I remember Nicholas Schaffner writing about that in the Beatles Forever, which was one of the slams that they made against Linda. I remember Nicholas Schaffner writing about this.
Now that you mention it, yes, I do remember that. Yes. Like she brought him down.
Right. You know, with Jane Asher, he was taking in the high culture and high arts at the cusp of everything in London. And with Linda, he's reading comic books. And I remember reading,
in my mind,
I remember reading Beatles Forever and saying, what the hell's wrong with comic books?
Yeah, it just speaks to my mind, like what an omnivore, what a cultural omnivore Paul was and probably still is, for all I know.
He has since written
from-
symphonies, right?
Yeah.
Well, you know, from John Cage to like Jack Kirby, it's extraordinary, Paul's capacity for just taking in culture. I love that Paul just sees it all as one thing. You know, it's like I mean, there are
Love a
quotes of
piece.
whatever that him saying like he doesn't see the difference between Al McCougan and the Rolling Stones. I'm making it up, but that idea that
Yeah.
it's all culture to Paul and it's all for the taking. And so yeah, so if he wants to see Ibsen in 1965, that's great. If he wants to read, Black Panther comics in 1976, that's great. It's
Yeah.
all just for the taking. It's all just something for Paul to feed off of.
Yeah.
I think that's
His
extraordinary.
kids are taking the Magrittes off the wall and coloring on them.
That's right.
Well, I mean, and
That's
he
right.
clearly had a respect for comics as an art form. He recognized it as a legitimate form of expression or art form, whatever it was. You and I talked one of my previous appearances, Robert, about when McCartney approached Marvel to do a comic book adaptation of Broad Street and had no concept of how that worked. Same way he didn't have any concept of how you put a movie together. Yeah, he had no concept of how
Yeah,
you put a
clearly.
comic.
He didn't know you had to have a script, so he had to ask Tom DeFalco, who was a previous
Oh, you
boss
know about
of
this?
Glenn's. Well, I've listened to
Oh,
the
that's right.
show, so yeah, I know about
Okay, yeah,
I
yeah,
know
yeah.
about it.
Yeah,
I only know
okay. Wow,
because you guys have talked about it. Yeah.
I'm
Yeah,
just so flattered that anybody listens to me. I'm so flattered that you're able to know that story and repeat it back. But yeah,
But it's interesting that Paul recognizes, though, that when he started as a youth, rock and roll would have been a junk culture. And he knew that it was art. And so for him to recognize comic books, which maybe still to this day is considered a junk culture
Anal and insipid.
in some ways. I mean, it's gained in stature for sure since then, but it's still considered in a way a junk culture. But Paul, again, he just recognized, no, it was culture. It's just something, it's art, it's something for you to take in and enjoy it or not. And as a guy, like I said, who would have entered into a junk culture and turned it into art, he would have known the potential in art forms. Again, like I said, who the fuck is this guy? His thinking is extraordinary sometimes.
Well, you
Well,
guys saw Beatles 64, right?
yeah. You know who was sitting a few rows behind me when I saw it? I told you that story, right?
Oh, remind me.
Paul McCartney.
Right. Okay. The part about where the reporter is talking about the cultural impact of the Beatles, February 64,
Yeah.
and he just immediately runs, offended that you even bring it up. We're just having a laugh.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
about this often. I actually think about this a lot because that quote comes up often, or probably on your show, Robert. But I think Paul is being mildly ingenuous and being genuine at the same time. He would have
I think that's
known.
completely on brand. I think you're right,
Yeah.
that he tried to have
Yeah.
it both ways.
Yeah. But I
Yeah.
also think his appreciation for comics comes a lot with clearly you see in that letter that I quoted from that he's interested in the ideas. He thinks the concepts are, and I think comics are fond of creativity and some mind-blowing ideas are done in comics, because you're only limited by your imagination. And so you've got guys like Jack Kirby who draw cosmic landscapes with gods fighting forces of cosmic nature and just the most incredible mind-blowing stuff. And I could see somebody like McCartney who appreciates great original ideas gravitating towards something like that. I could see John Lennon doing it too.
Right. Picking up on allegory and metaphor, the way that Rod
Yeah.
Serling discovered
And
you
mythology.
can comment on topical issues if you guys in science fiction, it's Martians, not the
Yeah.
Soviets or whatever, and tell the stories you want to tell by selecting a genre that to the casual person, oh yeah, it's about that fantastic thing that would never happen, even when it's happening here on Maple Street or whatever.
Right. Well, I know John was blown away by 2001: A Space Odyssey, and a lot of the stuff in the especially in the late '60s that Marvel was doing, that was basically 2001: A Space Odyssey on paper. That kind of really heady stuff. So yeah, I mean, I don't know how John felt about comics, but I could totally see why Paul would appreciate it as an art form. Yeah.
Speaking of John and comics, though, I will ask, because I mentioned this to you guys earlier in an email about, does anybody know anything more about the Daily Howl? Because John was clearly a cartoonist. This guy,
Yeah.
he wrote and he drew, and Paul will quote it in the anthology.
You remember that old joke? Tomorrow will be sunny, followed by money, tuny, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Tomorrow will be muggy, followed by chuggy, weggy, thuggy.
Whatever it is. So, he was a cartoonist. That fascinates me. Are there copies of this anywhere? Does anybody have images other than the ones we've seen? Has anybody talked about it? It's fascinating because this guy is a cartoonist, clearly.
I've seen pictures of, like, the cover
The
of
cover.
it, but not the contents, and,
Right.
obviously we
Yeah.
have what we have from in his own right, Spaniard in the Works, skywriting by word of mouth,
Yeah.
so it is our great fortune that seemingly it's been preserved,
Yeah.
notwithstanding and she threw the bastard stuff out, referring to Aunt Mimi and his childhood writings that men love, but, something seems to exist. So, but that you raise a really good point because now you've got me wondering, well, we know past a certain point with the Christmas messages when they're starting to get production in these things in 66, 67, where they're riffing on Goon Show and
Yeah.
a lot of that radio satire that they grew up on in the 50s. What I'm wondering is at Daily Howl, what was the precedent for that he might have picked up on that you could be satirical and mocking authority and stuff with drawings and with your wordplay? I don't know that he had Mad Magazine, or was there some English equivalent to that? It makes me wonder, what was he inspired by to do that sort of thing?
Yeah. Glenn, do you know did they have met in the UK? They must have. I mean, it wasn't a
Well,
small magazine by any means.
how old was John when he did the Daily Howl? Do we know that?
Somebody could give an answer with more precision, but I'm assuming it was before he was 15, when he was still
Okay.
at Quarry Bank
Okay, that
School.
might be
Okay,
that
because
might sort of work out. It might not. Yeah.
'Cause Mad started in 52.
52. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it started out as a comic book. A lot of people
Mhm.
don't
Yeah.
know that. It started out as
Right.
a comic book before it graduated to the magazine.
Mhm.
DC Comics. Oh, actually, DC and Mad were not owned by the same company back then, but
No.
DC Comics was making it into England to some extent. I don't know if EC Comics, because Mad was published by EC.
Right, educational comics.
Yeah, which was
Yeah.
anything but educational, because
Right.
they were also putting out like Tales from the Crypt, Weird Science,
It
Vault
was
of Horror, stuff
Let's
that
be
really
fair.
got the.
It was also entertaining comics. I mean, it wasn't. It was
was entertaining
so
comics.
Right.
E covers a lot, so it was educational.
They were
but it
definitely
was
more
also
entertaining than educational.
Did you guys ever
Definitely.
read The Mad World of Bill Gaines?
I skimmed it.
I
didn't
read that book
finish.
when I was still in school. Great, great book. And you're making me remember the time he's hauled before some congressional committee during this Red Scare era where they're trying to suppress stuff like that. And they ultimately kind of succeeded. But
Yeah.
there's an exchange in there where they're showing a picture from one of the horror comics. Here's a picture of a decapitated head being raised by and a knife, and it's
Yeah.
dripping blood, and he's defending it on the stand about, well, a tasteless person would have done this, but we did this,
Yeah.
that kind of thing.
He's right.
It's entertaining as hell. Right,
Yeah,
right.
yeah,
There's an
yeah.
art to this, folks.
Yeah.
I mentioned this to you guys in an email, but Britain actually has a long history of its own comic. They did get
Yeah.
imports from the States.
Beano?
was a huge comic book, and I think it goes pretty far back. Certainly John and Paul reading, and the other lads for sure reading. I mean, it's been around for a long time, and it was a humor mag. It had different features of different crazy characters, and it's likely they would have seen that for sure.
That's what I was wondering because I know it exists. I've never seen the inside of one. There's the Mayall album cover where Clapton's reading one, but you guys are probably familiar. There's like a picture of Paul, like a grade school picture where there's a whole class, and he's the one amidst this row of little young British kid faces. There's unmistakably 8-year-old or wherever old he was, Paul McCartney, making this face and standing out amongst those kids reading a comic book. Do you know what picture I'm talking about?
I think so.
No.
I think so, but I don't remember what comic book it was.
I don't either, but it's totally on brand for him. Cultural omnivore, but I'm going to stand out. I'm going to try to have it both ways. I'm going to be the naughty kid, but
Yeah.
I'm also going to be the one that people are going to be laughing at this picture decades from now.
Yeah.
Good for him. That's pretty cool. It's making me think,
Yeah.
though, now my day job generally as a cartoonist is as a character designer for television, for animation. And I think I might have said this to you before, Robert. It's interesting to me that Paul was not trained as an artist. John was. And even Paul claims, go talk to John, he's an artist. Paul clearly has drawn, he paints. But it's interesting. My theory a lot about the Beatles is visual iconography is imperative to them.
Yeah.
Just the idea of, I think I might have said to you before, Robert, if I had to design rock stars from space in 1962, they would have to look like the Beatles, because that looks like nothing that you were familiar with at that time. It doesn't look anything like Elvis. It doesn't look anything like Cliff Richard. They don't look anything like Frankie Avalon. They
Early
took
clue to the new direction.
they took a look and they brought it forward. I mean, in a way, they were perfect cartoon characters in the best sense. And to me, that means
You
like,
know what you're reminding me of right now? Did you guys ever see the American Graffiti satire in Mad Magazine?
Oh, yeah.
no,
Okay, you remember how it ends?
no.
The one character is chasing the blonde and the T-Bird
Yeah.
for the whole of the movie.
Yeah.
Well, in the Mad Magazine version, he catches up with her right at the end, and it has always been the back of the head with the long hair.
Yep.
Turns around, it's Ringo.
Yes.
You haven't heard of us yet, but we're going to be big.
That's
It's
right.
1962, right? Yeah.
Yep. Wow, I do remember that now.
That's brilliant.
It's been so long, but yes, I remember
Right.
that.
So what you're speaking of, Stephen, is like, this is the future, and it's about to hit you, America.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, and they somehow instinctively they knew like to get those haircuts, those French haircuts in when did they get them? 1960? What was it? New.
61,
Like, they didn't want to
when
look
John
like
turned 21, they went to Paris.
okay. They didn't want to look like everybody else. They were branding themselves, and they were branding themselves in the most memorable way. Yes, we are heirs to Elvis. We are heirs to Cliff Richard. We are heirs to the Shadows. But we're something new, and we have to look new. Even to get into suits, the iconography of the leathers is like, as Paul said, was ridiculous because that wasn't them. I mean, it was them at a time. It was the thing to wear to look like Gene Vincent. But after a while, it's like, no. We have to surpass that. We have to get beyond that. We have to redesign ourselves.
Right. They rode
designed
that wave for
themselves-
as long as they needed to with the stupid pink caps and the cowboy boots.
Yeah.
Well, that was Brian too, wasn't it? Brian was the one who was really pushing.
This was
for
up
it.
until Brian, yeah, right. But then it became the next chapter going forward in the future of their cultural development. Again, they're the guys in the crow's nest seeing land before anybody else does. It's like, this is the way we have to go. While people are still doing the matching shadows, dance moves, and that stuff, that, to your point, Stephen, about visual presentation, they were always about that, even before Brian, and certainly with Brian, they were all on the same page. It always makes me wonder, would a Stuart Sutcliffe and the people of that ilk, the Klaus, the Astrid, super visually conscious people and creators in their own right, that they connected with instantly, though they were from a different culture, the influence that they may have had on the Beatles going forward, was it already innate, or was it something that got sort of nurtured by these people who were a little bit more advanced than they were?
Yeah. And it just makes me think also that if you look at the Beatles separately, Robert, you and I have talked about the Al Brodak's cartoon, and I think those are great designs. My peers kind of make fun of them as bad animation, and they are, okay, but they're really well designed. And the great thing about the Beatles, again, talking about them visually, is John only looks like John. John looks like a guy that you would design. He doesn't look like, who knows what Cliff Richard looks like. Elvis is a really good looking guy, and really great looking guys are hard to caricature. But Paul is a great looking guy, but he's got these Submariner eyebrows that sort of, anybody who knows comics knows what I mean. These really strange arching eyebrows that go way like into his hairline. Ringo obviously is someone to look at. That nose is a focal point. You have to look at him. These are like comic book characters essentially, except that they're humans. I mean, and they just look great. They look at like the people that you want to look at. The Stones look like people you don't want to look at. The Stones look like people you want to get away from. But the Beatles are people like you want to know. I mean, you're fascinated by just even how they look. And that's a huge portion.
And who shared that trait was the Monkees.
Right.
Interesting. Tell me more about that.
I've got a monkey T-shirt that's like the sort of equivalent of the Brodex cartoons where they're depicted as cartoon characters.
Yep.
All four distinctive.
Right. Right.
Davy with the monobrow and blonde Peter and Mike with the hat and Mickey with the chin, and all very distinct features and characteristics that lend themselves to those sort of caricatures.
Right.
Yeah. Which is why when you see the Beatles depicted in comic books, you're justified to be very critical when the artists don't get them right, because they should be able to get them right. They're so distinctive, you should be able to tell. And in some of the stories, I told you about the one from '64 with the thing in the Human Torch where they don't look anything like the Beatles. But to this day, I'm still critical when I see them depicted. Sometimes they just don't get Paul right. or they have trouble like capturing George. So yeah, you're justified if you're critical of the artist as part of this conversation. There's a graphic novel that came out a few years ago called The Fifth Beatle, and it's about Brian
Vivek.
Epstein.
Mhm.
And it's you've had him on?
Oh, yeah, yeah, we're
Okay.
pals from the fest, yeah. Mhm.
Okay. Well, I finally got a chance to read it. I've had it since it came out, but it just sat on my bookshelf, and I finally got a chance to read it. And it's beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful, the artwork. And throughout, the Beatles are perfectly captured. And this is not photorealistic where the artist tries to make it look like you're looking at a three-dimensional image. No, but boy, he really captures their essence, the faces, throughout the entire book, throughout the different phases of their career throughout the 60s.
Speak more to that, because this is an interesting topic. I had him on the show very early on, and it was more in the context of a Brian Epstein conversation rather than about that book. But something that, not being a person steeped in that world, apart from the aforementioned stuff that I was into as a kid, that I can still enjoy, and you guys listening to both of you, I'm a lot way more open to entertaining the idea of immersing myself in comics than I ever was before, because now I'm recognizing there are levels to this stuff that you can get more into it and appreciate the art and all that stuff. But
We have a convert, Glenn. That's pretty good. We've sold a couple of issues now. That's great. That's good to know.
Yeah.
That's good to hear, Robert.
so who gets the toaster? Anyway,
Yeah.
what you got me to thinking is that, as somebody who clearly, to anybody who listens to this show, puts a high premium on factual accuracy, although what is truth? That's a whole other show unto itself. But whenever certainly you see tellings of the Beatles story or anything that is based on a real life event, and they get things wildly wrong, that critical part of your brain leaps on that and seizes that.
Yeah.
So when this came along, it wasn't part of my world. I remember reading it, enjoying it, and recognizing there's a story he wanted to tell that it's not about getting every data point correct. It was bigger than that. For the same reason somebody writes a novel, a historical fiction thing, a real life occurrence, but they tell it in novel form.
Yeah.
And then you've got Jude Kessler, who does novelizations of John Lennon's life. So I have absolutely come around to the way of thinking that sometimes factual accuracy as a way to tell a story doesn't suffice for every single need. If you're trying to convey an emotional, psychological truth to something, that maybe a graphic novel is entirely a suitable way to present a real life story to somebody that doesn't know anything. This is a way to draw them in. And then, of course, they can go read a Mark Lewison book after that if they want to know more. But this is a way to draw people in. So is that, in your experience, that seems to be an obvious thing?
Well, there's two really acclaimed graphic novels that came out over the past few years. One is called Lennon, The New York Years, and the other one is The Fifth Beatle, about Brian Epstein. And I read them both. I've read them both again this week to prepare for this conversation. I didn't like Lennon, The New York Years, because I felt that while it's based on fact, it's based on stuff that John has said, expressed, said he felt and all that, I felt like the writer embellished way too much. And so it came off as inauthentic to me, in the sense that this is supposed to be John Lennon. He's unloading all of his feelings, his observations, his thoughts about everything to a therapist throughout the New York years. The guy in this book did not feel like John Lennon to me, At least the John Lennon that I grew up reading, seeing, hearing, all that stuff. So that didn't work for me. Now, the Brian Epstein book sort of does the same thing. It's not factually accurate in places. There is stuff that's glaringly, and have you read it, Robert, then you know all this too.
Right. But I guess knowing Vivek, I kind of understood where he was coming from. He wasn't there to write the definitive history of Brian Epstein.
Right. I felt like they got a lot of the emotion right. They got the tone right. And I will tell you that the gorgeous artwork overcame whatever sins there were in the writing. It was a beautiful book to look at. And it captured the 60s. Looked like one of those really stylish movie posters. It had that kind of artwork that you'd see in those really stylish, slick movie posters, movies that were released during the swinging 60s kind of thing,
So it captured the zeitgeist.
It captured the zeitgeist. But there's a movie that also I felt really made me feel like I was there in London in the 1960s. Last Night in Soho.
No, I haven't seen that.
Okay, me either.
You watch it and you really feel like you're there in the swinging 60s.
Okay, cool. I will take a note of that.
And this book was able to do that same thing. So in terms of these graphic novels that, again, the Brian Epstein book got like the highest honors in the comic book industry. It won like the Eisner Award, which is like, that's like the Oscars. If you're looking for accuracy, if you're looking for like the definitive, it's kind of like, I liken it to, there's all these movies that they try to make about Dracula, try to like make all these movies about Dracula. This is the definitive, this is the most faithful version to the novel. And no, they're not. Each one in its own ways just gets it wrong. This is the same thing. I liken it more to like a Hollywood biopic, which for me, the cream of the crop is Love and Mercy, the Brian Wilson one. And even that didn't get everything exactly right, but it got the tone, it got the spirit. And so the Brian Epstein book, I felt did that in a way that the John Lennon New York years one did not.
Stephen, have you seen the
can't find
Fifth Beatle?
I can't. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I have. I have it, but I can't find it, which is typical for me. I have no idea where most of my books are, but they're all over the place. A few pages of the Fifth Beatle is drawn by my old friend Kyle Baker, but generally the entire book is drawn by one artist. And I can't think of who it is. It's really handsome.
Andrew
and
Robinson.
They're two different. Oh, okay. It's a great looking book. I remember that for sure. And it's interesting because Kyle comes in and draws very, very cartoony few pages.
Yeah.
I don't
One
know, maybe a
sequence.
handful of pages.
One sequence, about 10 pages.
Yeah, which owes a little probably more to Al Brodax than anything else.
Yes, very much so.
Which I thought was very funny for Kyle to do that. But it's a great looking book and highly recommended. I thought it was. Yeah, I don't remember, Glenn, how factual or unfactual it was. I might have noticed if things were off, but it feels right. It was a good feel to it.
From my experience with the book, the fact that I concurrently with getting the book, I think I might have actually made the acquaintance of Vivek at the fest, like adjoining tables or something like that, where we got to talk before I actually got to crack open the book. So it was like I was properly prepped for my expectations going into it. He researched the hell out of it, but then he wrote the story he wanted to because he wanted to convey the essence and feel and times of Brian Epstein. And his motivating thing was that he saw Brian as an inspirational figure for his own life to go into the world that he became successful. He's a Broadway producer, and he did this as a way of sort of trying to turn the public onto Brian Epstein's story because he saw him as very much an outsider that made good and brought something that we still talk about to the world.
Right.
That is an amazing story.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as you said, or I think you were saying, Robert, it's like to tell a truth, you have to tell a couple lies, I mean, that's art. You want to get to the heart of what the truth is. So you condense it or you make it up, and it's about the truth of the feeling rather than it is the factual stuff. I mean, if you want to read factual stuff, you could read that Dell comic or that Marvel comic that Glenn was talking about before, and those facts are wrong anyway. You could read something that has a factual feeling to it, and I did notice that.
Whereas
about that book,
where I felt like with the Lennon book, I was harsher towards that one just because it's like you're trying to bring John Lennon to life in a certain way, and if you don't nail it, the whole thing falls apart. And I remember reading the first few pages and like, this doesn't feel like John. It doesn't feel like stuff he would say or how he would say it or what he'd be doing, like, talking to the psychiatrist and all that. And it was just like, it wasn't his voice to me. And so like, I don't want to spend however many dozens of pages with this guy. So I never really finished it. It didn't work for me. Whereas the Epstein book, I went all the way through. And a lot of it did have to do with the fact that it was just a joy to look at. It was gorgeous.
It's a good looking book.
I love that style.
It's a really nice looking book.
Yeah.
One book I wanted to mention is a book called, and again, I can't find it in my collection, so I'm going on pure memory here. I believe it came out in 2010, but it's called Babies in Black. It's about the story Stuart and Astrid Kircher. And obviously the Beatles are in it. It's a black and white book, but beautifully, beautifully drawn. Actually, quite a bit cartoony, but somewhat manga influenced, but more European. Anyway, it's a really handsome book, and it's a really interesting story and told very respectfully. And it's nice. It's interesting to see the Beatles story, but through that prism of, well, they're not the main characters. They're just kind of along for the ride. Sort of like Backbeat, I suppose, but I actually think it was a little bit better than and backbeat. It's a great looking book, and yeah, highly recommended. And again, I don't have it. I don't have it in front of me. I haven't read it in a while, but I do remember thinking of it fondly. And if there were factual gaffes in it, maybe I noticed, but it didn't matter so much because it was so well presented. It was so well done. And yeah, I probably said already, it's highly recommended. I do encourage the listeners to check that out. I thought it was a terrific little piece of work.
That's great to know.
It might be a European. I have the name. Other than that, I don't know who this artist is. Is it making sense to you? I mean, does it make sense to you as a presentation? I definitely think we should mention our mutual friend Carol Tyler's book,
Oh,
Fab Four
sure. There you go.
Mania, which obviously you've spoken to Carol and you've had her on your show, and she's a terrific person and a phenomenal artist. And that was 2018 seemed to be a huge convergence for comics and the Beatles. I've noticed. There's a few books that came out in 2018, and Carol's was one of them. And it's a great book. It's really beautiful. And Carol has a new book out, which is highly recommended. Just really, really beautiful. And Carol's like one of the
Ephemerata.
treasures. Yeah, Carol's one of the treasures of comic books, the medium. So that's highly recommended as well.
And see, I knew nothing of her or any of that stuff until I landed on a news story about Fab Four Mania being written, and I had her on the show. And then we've since, as you know, reconvened a few times since then because I could listen to her talk endlessly. And I love the conversation you had with her on your Not a Podcast show on YouTube. And yeah, The Ephemerata is a beautiful book that she just came out and she's getting all kinds of recognition for it, which is amazing. But Fab Four Mania, it was revelatory to me. I thought on the surface level, wow, it's cool. Here's a 15-year-old or however old she was, 13 at the time, from my hometown that went to see the Beatles and documented it in real time. This is great. And she's so articulate and her art has such immediacy to it. We've
Yeah.
been talking about comics and fantasy to this point. This was something real life, a memoir, a visual memoir of sorts. But, she's done all kinds of other stuff as well, like Soldier's Heart about her father's World War II experiences. Amazing to me that there exists this medium that satisfies the need to convey important and real stories that isn't reliant on fact checkers or data points or all this other stuff. It's the immediacy of the visual presentation that she is so amazingly good at. So it opened my horizons for sure.
That's awesome. Yeah. Yeah. And if, some of your listeners who have not checked it out yet want to do that, and it opens up comics. I guess Glenn and I could probably go on forever about like comics. I've heard people say comics are a genre, and that's ridiculous. They're not a genre. They're a medium. It's like
Yeah,
film, or it's like the opera,
absolutely.
or and it's any story that can be told via comics, whether it's the deepest, most psychological, whether it has psychological depth to it, or whether it's, guys fighting each other in
Right.
their long underwear. It's whatever can be represented as a story or a concept can be told in comics. And yeah, like I said, Glenn and I could probably go on for several decades about the beauty of the art of cartooning and comics.
Yeah.
But it's true. And if anybody read comics as a kid but hasn't thought about them in decades, it might be a good time to revisit them because some of them haven't aged very well, as I'm sure Glenn and I can attest, but some of them have grown more beautiful as time's gone by. It's a truly wonderful way to express yourself. Speaking as an artist who's drawn and written them, it's a great way to express yourself.
And it's an art form, it's a medium or art form whatever, that has evolved in the same way television has evolved. And that, you go back to the 60s and the 70s, what were the big dramas? Gunsmoke, Dragnet, more recently, what are the great TV shows? Breaking Bad. Breaking Bad is not a show that could have been done in the 60s or 70s. And comics has gone the same way. Comics has grown up in many ways. And so I think that is why it is more accepted, because with the advent of all the movies, gotten people to look a little bit more seriously at comics. And then you're making movies. The Tom Hanks movie that he made with Paul Newman,
Road to Perdition?
The Road to Perdition,
Oh
that's
yeah,
based on a comic book,
right.
basically.
That's a graphic novel. Yeah.
Ghost
Wow,
World.
I don't think I knew that.
Yeah, this great movie, Ghost World, directed by Terry Zwigoff, It was one of Scarlett Johansson's earliest films,
Yes,
based
loved
on
it.
a comic book, a graphic novel.
Mhm.
So, it's not just guys in tights and capes flying around fighting each other. It is a medium that has its own subgenres. And so you can do biographies about the Beatles or about Brian Epstein, all different topics, subject matter. And it doesn't have to be superheroes. And I think that's why you do get something like that, The Fifth Beatle, which, again, would I have liked it to have been a little bit more accurate historically? Sure, because, in addition to my comic book background, I also have a journalism background. So when you're dealing with historical things, I want it to be historically accurate. So the Brian Epstein book completely leaves out the fact that Pete Best ever existed. It goes straight to Ringo. And so that kind of irked me a little bit, because one of the big moments of Brian's career as their manager was he was the one who had to fire Pete. And that's not in there. I'm like, well, it should be. So that's one of my quibbles about it. But boy, does it look good. But stuff like that. So yeah, end of soliloquy.
I said, yeah, yeah, yeah. He said, yeah, yeah, yeah. She said, yeah, yeah, yeah. We said, yeah, yeah, yeah. I said, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Bug music!
We can't stand bug music.
That bug music drives us plumb loco.
Something About the Beatles. Created and hosted by Robert Rodriguez. Executive producer Rick Way. Title song performed by the Corgis.
Something About the Beatles is an evergreen podcast.
Yippee! It's time for the Beagles, starring Stringer, Tubby, and their ever-loving agent, Scotty.
Looking for the Beagles, looking high and low. Higher for the Eagles, low is where the Beagles go. Oh, riding on a busted bubble to wherever there's some trouble. That's where the Beagles go. Trouble's not a sometime thing, it is but won't die out. Pleasure makes the Beagles sing, trouble makes them shout. Looking for the Beagles. I won't forget the night we met, a moonlit night in June. Who could be all bathed in gold, back to the man in the moon.
The Beagles. This portion presented by Topper Toys, makers of Johnny Speed, the big, beautiful, speeding sports car that you drive by remote control. Johnny Speed.